Welcome back to Asia Pacific Security Dialogue. And now we'll proceed to the final panel discussion, assessing the post-COVID-19 economic outlook, reconfiguring globalization and building trusted supply chains. And here is our moderator, Senior Deputy Director of Taiwan WTO and RTA Center, Zhonghua Institution for Economic Research, Mr. Roy Lee. Please welcome.
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank all the audience to join us for the last but not the least session of today's forum. And I have the privilege to serve as the moderator for this session. The topic of this session is to assess the economic outlook post-COVID-19 pandemic. And we have invited our 4 distinguished panelists to focus on one and with likely long-term effect issue. That is the new reconfiguration of the globalization and also the building of a trusted partnership and supply chain. The pandemic has brought about great impact on the global supply chain and also many livelihoods of our daily lives. The global supply chain, as we know of, was created around 70 years ago based on the principle of economic efficiency and profit arbitrage. Over time, import dependency and concentration, because of the pandemic, becomes the sources of vulnerability. Resilience, for example, and diversification are now popular thinking among not only the private sector, but also many governments around the globe. Further, the changing view towards China, in particular, from a strategic partner to a strategic rival, is also pushing Western democratic and market-based countries to rethinking and reassess the economic and security risks associated with the so-called world factory structure. These reforms require a complex set of the grand rethinking of strategies, a comprehensive review and the planning process, and more importantly, a dedicated implementation work plan to rebuild a trusted supply chain. There are numerous opportunities and, of course, uncertainties. And luckily, we are at good hands today. The 4 panelists that are joining us for this session are more than qualified to enlighten us for the complex set of issues involved. Let me introduce them briefly. The first speaker is Honorable Hyun Oh-suk, the former Deputy Prime Minister and the Minister of Economic Affairs and Finance of the Republic of Korea. Honorable Hyun, we welcome you.
Very nice to meet you.
Thank you.
And I really appreciate that. Thank you.
And Honorable Hyun is now serving as the chair of the ESG committee, ES Holding in Korea. Our second panelist is Director Bert Hoffman. He is now the director of the East Asian Institute, National University of Singapore. Director Hoffman, we welcome you. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
And the third speaker of this session is Dr. Scott Kennedy, Senior Advisor and Trustee Chair of the in Chinese Business and Economics Center for Strategic and International Studies, or CSIS. Scott is a good and old friend of Taiwan because he is the only one joining this session from a non-working time zone. It's actually now 3:40 a.m. in Washington. And Scott, I hope you have to enjoy the session to keep awake and to accompany us and reflect on your thoughts. Thank you very much, Scott.
Thank you. I wouldn't miss it for the world.
Thank you. And the fourth speaker, the panelist of this session, is Director Hosuk Lee Makiyama, who is also a good and old friend to Taiwan. He is now the director of the European Center for International Political Economy. Hosuk, thank you. Welcome.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Let me now invite our first speaker, Honorable Hugh, to take the floor. Honorable Hugh.
Thank you very much, moderator. It's really a wonderful occasion with a very knowledgeable panelists in this session. So I'll make a couple of points on the general globalization issues and a couple of points on more specific supply chain issues. As you all know that even before the pandemic, the globalization was in trouble. The open system has been damaged by financial crash and trade war. And now it is reeling again as lockdowns have sealed borders and disrupted commerce. And also the pandemic might politicize and entrench a bias towards self-reliance. Around the world, the public opinion is also shifting away from globalization. There are growing worries that supply chains have become a source of vulnerability. The push to bring supply chains back home in the name of resilience is accelerating. Global supply chains are threatened by so-called collective action problem. Let me take semiconductors as an example, as they are the first strategic industries. All of the world's most advanced semiconductor manufacturing capacity in nodes below the 10 nanometers is currently located in Taiwan and Korea. This concentration will have a big tailwind in the form of China's recent 5-year plan. And also, not only the US, but also European countries are trying to build more local supply. I think not every country can or should have a cheap foundry. However, the idea that quite a large share of a certain industry is concentrated in one of the world's, I think, most contentious geopolitical regions isn't just bad politics. It's in some sense bad economics. I think in a real ideal world, like-minded countries, including the US and EU, even Taiwan, would work together on common industry standards to create an even larger common market and to promote innovation and to share ideas and even some intellectual property. I think this can be an important part of any new alliances of democracies. Regionalism, I think, is not the same thing as nationalism. Against such a backdrop, it makes sense for supply chains to be more robust. When national security is at stake, governments have a role in making supplies more secure. However, it should be limited one. They can provide research and development, including for new energy sources. However, the risk is that countries go beyond the minimum intervention that they get vocal for local. Such a rush towards autarky would not be justified. One reason is that the government-administered domestic supply chains are even less resilient than global ones. So the call for self-reliance also misconstrues the balance between the cost of interdependence, which are very brief and visible, and its benefits, which trickle in months after months unheralded. And the buildup of cost would be a hidden tax on consumers. So the result to autarky is like looking for kids under street light, not because that is where they were lost, but because that's where it is brightest. So resilience comes not from autarky, but from diverse source of supply and constant private sector adaptation to shocks. So over time, the global firms will adjust to even longer term threats, including tensions between US and China and the effects of climate change. So let me finish here. Now is the really perilous moment for the world economy. But however, just as globalization begets the openness, so protection in one country spread to the next. So in that sense, I think that globalization is the most important issues related to supply chain. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Honorable Hume. There are also a lot of debates here in Taiwan on the way globalization should proceed, and also on the direction of the reconfiguration of the global supply chain. Morris Chang, for example, the founding member of the TSMC, or the world leaders in semiconductor, was talking about, arguing last month, actually, during an APEC summit, that it will not be feasible politically and economically if all countries want to turn back the clock, referring to a complete decoupling and complete restructuring or moving away from the global supply chain as we know of. So I think Honorable Hume was also offering some recommendations and also direction of change to address national concern, but also not to destroy all the establishment that we are able to achieve during the last 70 years of efforts. Thank you very much, Honorable Hume. Let me invite our next speaker, Director Hoffman from National University of Singapore, to take the floor.
Well, thank you very much, and thanks to the Prospect Foundation for this invitation. I'm very happy to be part of this. And I'm very happy to be in this discussion because it is an important discussion, and decisions made in the aftermath of the COVID crisis could determine the efficiency and the welfare of people all around the world for a very long time to come. In that context, I am a bit more of an optimist in terms of supply chains, and I'd like to argue that actually COVID-19 has shown the resilience of much of the supply chains rather than the issues in the supply chains. And if we look at the economic prospects, they're still improving. Yes, the decline last year was steep and hurt many people, but the world economy did not decline as much as we had expected. At the height of the fear of COVID, there was an expectation by the IMF that the world would decline by about 5 percentage points in GDP. The outcome was less than 3.5 percentage point decline. That's a big decline, and it was very broad-based, and many people, especially in developing countries, got hurt. But since then, things have looked up. Yes, there's still lots of uncertainties, and the rollout of the vaccine is not that great, but the current expectation for this year is that the world economy would grow by something around 6%. So a very strong rebound. Similarly, with world trade and world trade in goods. World trade in goods went into a steep decline in March, April last year, but then recovered very rapidly and is now above the pre-COVID-19 levels. And that's a broad-based recovery. Yes, China was out first, and China benefited from all other countries struggling with containing COVID and therefore losing a lot of production capacity. But since then, recovery has been broad. The only part of the world that is not yet above pre-COVID levels is Latin America. In contrast, of course, you have travel and many services, frankly, that do far less well. Trade in services is still down, and especially because of travel. not because of transport. And transport is actually booming in the aftermath of COVID-19. And I think it's an interesting. Yes, there's lots of disruptions. There's lots of shortages everywhere. As in fact, this morning's New York Times has a long article about how many shortages are still around, and there's shortages especially in chips, but a shortage in everything, in wood, in many commodities. But the real bottom line there is transport, and chips is maybe a bit of a special case. Chips is, if you want, the underestimation of demand and the misestimation of demand by both suppliers and demand. And especially from the car industry, which thought that they were going to be in a low demand situation. It turns out they're actually in a high demand situation because of the rapid recovery of the world economy. And therefore they are short of chips, because their competitors that did very well are not other car companies. Their competitors are computer industry. Their competitors are the game industry, and they, because of the COVID-19 situation, experienced a boom and therefore massively increased their demand. Second, the timing of the recovery has caused an enormous amount of havoc. The reason is that China was up first, and the United States was still down, Europe was still down. And that meant that an awful lot of containers ended up in the wrong place and could not be filled and shipped back. And so this disruption in the global supply chains from the shipping point of view was indeed quite disruptive. And you see that the prices of transport, of sea transport in particular, have shot up. But the situation is not that dissimilar to what happened after the global financial crisis. If you look at the Baltic Dry Trade Index, it shot up by about the same percentage as after the global financial crisis, where the recovery in world trade was a bit slower. So in that sense, I mean, it's a very volatile index, and it's not that exceptional. Added to the COVID worries were particular incidents. This is Taiwan, so I shouldn't really mention, but I will mention the evergreen incident in the Suez Canal. There were port closures, the Yan'an port closure because of the COVID aftermath, the Ningbo port closure that causes temporary disruptions. And those temporary disruptions, they do trickle through the economy, because we all rely on these boxes called containers that ship our goods around the world. But overall, as I said, of course, the shipping companies do very well. Maersk, one of the largest shipping companies, I looked at their annual statement. Last year, they quintupled their net profits because of the very high prices in transport. So if you had transport available, you could make big money. Now, so despite all this disruption, I said world trade has held up really well, and there's been miracles created in global supply chains as well, and I refer to the vaccines. Chad Brown and colleague from PIIE, the Patterson Institute of International Economics, have done a wonderful paper on how supply chains came together to create those vaccines that are now saving the world. And it's dozens of countries that come together, and this is only the first line of supply chain that they're looking at. It's miraculous that they came together in such difficult times to create the vaccines that made it possible. And overall, you see that companies, but also countries that relied on a very dense network of supply, did relatively well. I live in Singapore, which is probably one of the smallest countries, not the smallest, but a small country that's enormously open, relies a lot on world trade. And maybe only for a week after there were measures taken back in March 2020, there were some shortages in my shop, but afterwards they got resolved. And it's remarkable how a country that is so open to world trade, that is so dependent on imports for its daily living, actually did relatively well. That's an experience that you see in other countries. That's an experience you see in other companies. Those companies that have a very wide and deep supply chain and that have the possibility of substituting suppliers did very well. Toyota for a long time held up really well. They now have to cut their production because of the shortage of chips. But for a long time they could rely on shifting the supply chains across the world to where things were available, and that showed the flexibility and the resilience that modern supply chains do have. At the same time, there is not just COVID-19, and we already heard from the previous speaker on the geopolitical threat to supply chains. And frankly, in my view, that's going to be the longer term influence. The political temperature has maybe come down a little bit with the entry of the Biden government, but at the same time, there is still widespread concern about the reliance of many countries and many products on China. China is really quite central, more central for the US than it is for Europe. Europe's supply chains, intra-European supply chains, are stronger, if you want, than the supply chains that are centered around the US. And therefore the US relies more on external supply chain, and of course China is quite central to that. How disruptive that will be remains to be seen, but it remains to be seen how broad the policies that a Biden administration wants to apply to the issue of strategic competition with China, and we don't know yet, frankly. For now, the Biden administration has continued by and large the Trump administration's policies, and that is a very scattershot approach, quite broad, with lots of targets and maybe not that efficient. There is talk now in Washington to target smaller yards with very high fences, rather than try to fence off everything from exposure to China. And that is probably the right approach, given the centrality of China, given the enormous integration that China has with the rest of the world. It's very unlike the Soviet Union. In the old days, the Soviet Union, total trade with the Soviet Union was not more than 1.5, 2 percentage points of all trade of advanced countries. For China, it is 18%. So it would be enormously disruptive if there were to be an unwinding of that of those supply relationships. In tech, it's even more complex. I mean, one of the big victims of the Huawei sanctions is TSMC, and it is Qualcomm, it is Foxconn, because they have very high exposure to these Chinese companies. So you may think you target one particular company, but you really target the whole supply chain, and those supply chains are global. So a careful, and sure, there are strategic goods, sure, there are dual-use goods that any country would want to get more control over, and there the United States is in its right, just like China has particular categories of goods that it would want to protect. But to try to indeed to make those yards that you want to protect as small as possible is the wisest policy. With that, let me stop, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Director Hoffman. Just a quick footnote to complement your optimistic view. Taiwan's export has been enjoying a positive growth for the last 19 months now. Before the pandemic, during the pandemic, even better after the pandemic. Yes, it's a demonstration of how worlds are connected through networks and how trade is able to recover very swiftly from the initial impact of the COVID-19. And we wish the world global trade and also the global supply network continue to grow with some adjustments, of course. And you mentioned part of the adjustment is kind of inevitable, especially towards the critical technology and other sensitive sectors. And the US-China rivalry will become a very important factor in playing out the new dynamics of the global supply chain reform. For that, I'm going to invite Scott Kennedy to address some of these very important dimensions, especially the US-China rivalry. Scott, you have the floor. Thank you.
Terrific. Well, Dr. Lee, thank you for hosting this session, and thanks to the Prospect Foundation for bringing us all together. I've not been able to enjoy jet lag for almost 2 years now, and this is my one opportunity to do so. So I really appreciate the opportunity to do it at least for a few minutes, and I'm looking forward to the vaccines that Bert just described reaching the arms of everyone in Taiwan and throughout the region so that I can actually really enjoy some jet lag in the coming months. We have a lot of work to do, and as much as I enjoy being in my basement and doing research on my computer, I actually much more enjoy visiting Taiwan and the region, and so hope to do so soon. We are in danger of forming a consensus in this panel, and which I think is good. It may be a little bit boring for those watching, but it does also mean that we probably find ourselves in disagreement with a lot of policymakers in Washington, in Beijing, and in some other capitals because of things that they feel about their own country's economic needs and risks, as well as just simply reacting to others. And so that tit for tat process may end up bringing policymakers to do things which we don't all agree in, but it's at least we can sound the alarm bells and we can give them some guideposts for some work that they ought to do as they make these decisions. So I'm going to say, there's, and in Washington, D.C., there are a lot of folks who are talking about resilient supply chains based on the pandemic and early shortages in PPE, now auto chips, a whole ton of reasons why people are talking about the need to have more resilient supply chains or bring manufacturing home. Economic reasons, political reasons, national security reasons, human rights reasons. And I think that's one place where you'll see a bunch of consensus in Washington. And the chances for new policy initiatives actually in the coming few days are quite significant. First, actually with the executive branch, and then actually potentially with Congress by the end of this year. I'm also skeptical, as the previous speakers are, with some of this logic, and I'm worried that we're going to go too far. Although I don't think in some places we ought to overly criticize these concerns. So let me outline a couple places where I think there are some reasons that are justified to modify supply chains, and then places where I'm more skeptical, and then sort of lessons for everybody. So I think for human rights reasons, most of the discussion, I think, is entirely reasonable about reducing supply chain risks. If you want to uphold certain types of human rights, and you think trading with China, buying cotton from Xinjiang, or contracting out to factories that are from Xinjiang may involve human rights abuses, well, why should you be forced to do business with them? Now, the evidence is mixed, but the Chinese intentionally make the evidence very hard to obtain. And in fact, they're making it more hard to obtain. Global companies that produce in China are having increasing difficulty carrying out third-party audits of their supply chains to identify whether or not there's any forced labor in those supply chains. The Chinese government is intentionally intimidating and stopping these audits from occurring. So if you can't verify that your supply chain is free of these problems, then that suggests maybe you ought to reduce your exposure. So I can totally think that it might be entirely justified for the United States to decouple from Xinjiang, even if it doesn't make sense to decouple from China. I understand the evidence is complex, but nevertheless, I think the onus is on the Chinese, not on us. In addition, there's reasons for climate change. The costs of global transportation are quite high. That burns a lot of fossil fuels in global transportation. And if we can source things more locally and reduce the damage to the environment, that also makes sense. There are other areas, though, where there's a lot of focus on supply chains where I think the evidence is much more mixed. So from the economic side, the idea that we need to radically reduce our trade around the world, including with China, simply because we need more resilient supply chains to protect jobs and our competitiveness, I don't think is very persuasive. We often see this statistic that China now makes 60% of the world's electric car batteries. Well, so what? The reason they do so is because China's got a big electric car market. If we want to have a lot of electric cars, batteries that we make in the United States, well, gosh, encourage electric car sales. And then we'll start building a lot of electric batteries here. That just seems like a simple math thing. It has nothing to do with Chinese protectionism or industrial policy. There's another statistic that only 12% of semiconductors are manufactured in the United States. Again, I don't really think that matters very much. We have 70 plus fabs in the United States. Maybe we'll have 10 more. Will that really change everything? We aren't overly dependent on semiconductors from dangerous, so-called dangerous countries. Most of them come from countries in Southeast Asia, Korea, Taiwan. China does a lot of package and assembly and testing. That can be done in many different places. And China is so dependent on the rest of the world for chips that we really have this sort of mutual assured provision of goods because of that. A lot of talk about medical supplies and the dangers there. With regard to, certainly with regard to PPE and masks, certainly the US faced major shortages, but those were mostly caused by a sudden jump in demand, not because we didn't have enough on hand, and also because we didn't have enough emergency stockpiles. If we had emergency stockpiles in medical equipment like we do for oil, where we can online right here, right now, see exactly what our national reserves are, we would very quickly be able to adjust if we needed to, but we don't. In terms of medical devices and drugs, we've done the math in our program, and China is a supplier of less than 5% of medical devices to the United States, less than 10% of APIs, very few drugs, final drugs to the United States. Most come from Ireland, in fact, that are imported in the United States. The one area where we are heavily dependent on China is antibiotics. So I would say diversify for antibiotics. But for the others, actually things are working pretty well. Let me say a little bit about national security and then wrap things up, because there I think actually there are some real risks because of potential surveillance that the Chinese can carry out against the US through putting eavesdropping mechanisms into telecom equipment or drones or things like that. But the way to deal with that, maybe in some instances, if you determine you can avoid the risks, is to only work with trusted suppliers from allies. But it may be just setting up systems of certification that anyone can apply for, and that anyone can, if they meet the standards, provide to global markets. You can have rules about data collection, data storage, content, rules that apply to everyone. I actually think that's the direction that the Biden administration is going in. The last thing I want to say about national security is that we should not forget the national security benefits from trade in high-tech goods with China and other rivals. That not only generates a huge amount of income for high-tech companies that allow them to plow that money back into R&D, which then allows them to innovate and improve our national security, what it also does, in almost every instance that I've looked at, is when we have the Chinese connected to us in high-tech sectors, in almost every single instance, it is the US and its friends at the top of these technology hierarchies, and the Chinese lower in these technology hierarchies. And these hierarchies are very, very difficult to adjust. And so you don't think of China like from a Latin American country and from the 1960s and talking about dependency, but there are dependencies created, and in fact, China's dependencies are greater than ours that we have on them, and that is to our benefit from a national security perspective. So I'm not making an argument for economics and against national security. They actually align with each other. Final point, and then I'll throw things back to you, Roy, is lessons. The big question is, do we want to engage in trade even with rivals? And I think the answer is yes, to the extent that we can. We may need some small yards with some big fences, but overall, trade works both for us economically and for national security. And I think we need to be careful what we wish for, because if we reduce connectivity, we're actually potentially encountering problems which we actually had avoided for a long time because of the benefits that we don't really understand that we currently have. Next point is the trends that are occurring in Washington, D.C. and Beijing work directly against Taiwan's own interests. The less the U.S. and China trade, the more there is a division down the Pacific. That means less U.S.-Taiwanese trade, less U.S.-Taiwanese investment, less U.S.-Taiwanese interdependence, and less of a foundation for national security cooperation. The more we divide, the greater there's use of industrial policy and an industrial policy arms race. That means more spending, less efficiencies, greater debt, all the kinds of problems that China's economy has. That means we're also going to be less able to address the kinds of problems that the WTO has with trying to govern this complex world, because we're going to take the disciplines and just totally throw them away, and they'll likely dissolve. Last suggestion. For everything, I think it's really important that we do the math. And we've got folks on this call and others watching who can help governments do math. Because if there's anything there's anything that we've learned over the last few years, is that math matters, and that you can't just simply pull stuff out of your ear just because it sounds good. So let's do the math. Let's show it to them, and maybe they'll make better choices in the end. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Scott, for your three very concise but tangible recommendations. I think we're going to have a lot of discussions, if not debates, about China's role in this globalization reconfiguration. You touch upon slightly on China's industrial policy, for example, and I can come up with a number of examples here in Taiwan that fall victim into China's industries policy that end up oversupply and also destroying all the other alternative supply sources because of China's policy. And also, there will be hidden agenda problems that we receive a lot of attention also here in Taiwan. Economic policy intertwined with a lot of unspoken political agenda. But I'll address those as questions during our Q&A sessions. Let me waste no time and to invite our fourth panelist, Hoseok Lee Makiyama from the European Center for International Political Economy. Hoseok, you may have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Roy. And thanks to all excellencies and distinguished guests present, but most of all, my dear Taiwanese friends. I'm really, really privileged to join you again at the Katalogan Forum this year. And amongst another very impressive lineup, actually, of distinguished international guests and scholars. And as the last speaker in the last panel, I do dare say that all the good ideas are already taken. So whatever you hear from me is really optional. I was actually the one that spoke 4 a.m. last year, and I would say that I will speak for Taiwan and this forum any time of the day and anywhere in the world, but preferably from Taiwan. So hopefully we'll see you all next year. And yeah, the topic of the panel, I think, is topical as ever. Economic security, I think, has become a mainstay in the discussion. But I would like to argue that it's a very different threat than what we see in think tank reports written by young Turks. And it's actually a reality that central bankers, trade negotiators, and army general must take into account in a completely different way in the post-pandemic recovery. And I have been saying now for the duration of the pandemic that we will see a two-phase recovery. And I do dare say that we are approaching the second phase, but in a very different manner than we thought. We began the early stages of the post-pandemic recovery by creating actually an unprecedented situation where one economy, mainland China, accounted for nearly all of the world's growth. And such concentration itself is a tremendous macro political and economic risk, whoever that country is, whether it's Luxembourg, Taiwan, or mainland China. That is the nature of the problem, that we had a huge concentration. And until now, and as we heard from the previous speakers, it was also created largely by investments. And recent highlighted supply chain vulnerabilities in certain products, for example, like particular line of medical products in the early days of the recovery, but also before the pandemic, we've seen similar crises in rare earth and certain extent also in very limited parts of the electronic sector, where we have seen extremely high concentration of fixed assets going into and production resources going into the mainland, which has posed a very hard problem for us to crack. And this problem is basically not necessarily just by the fact that it is a one economy, but it's also the fact that it is an economy that is willing to direct it in a direction that suits its political interest. And that, I think, where the real underlying problem is. But let me turn to Taiwan, because as so often, Taiwan is the light in a very dark world. And we have seen the predictions of GDP growth in Taiwan being now written up from 4.6 to 5.5. Now we are looking at close to 6% GDP growth before the end of the year. We've heard from Roy, export growing 28% year on year. This is fantastic. But it also shows to a certain vulnerability in the Taiwan's economic model. We need world growth in order to spur export-led growth in an economy like Taiwan. I come back to that, but another actually optimistic sign we are seeing is that for Taiwan, reshoring seems to be working. Investment is now actually moving back into Taiwan or created indigenously in Taiwan. $1 trillion Taiwan dollar has been returned from mainland economy. And in fact, I would even argue that this is the only economy in the world where the reshoring seems to be working, that money is actually moving back into Taiwan. And it has, of course, been helped by the great faster rate of digitalization that we've seen thanks to the pandemic. But there are also other signs that are very similar to other economic recovery we've seen in Taiwan in the past. For example, like the global financial crisis, which basically means that the recovery process is primarily export-led. It has led to increased over-specialization. As for now, as we have a huge deal of supply chain mismatches and shortages and price spikes, it works very well for Taiwan. But I am worried in the long term that it needs to diversify from the export-led model into other growth models that will serve the Taiwanese people well into the future. But as we are now going into the second stage of the recovery, as we predicted, GDP is now bouncing back globally. I think it's at 6% according to IMF. I do agree with Professor Hoffman that the supply chains are far more resilient than expected. But what we have seen is that the trading system don't manage shortages very well, and not least in vaccines. And there are many reasons to be worried about this. But we are also seeing a two-track recovery. The fault line is no longer between emerging versus stagnant advanced economies, not between the East or the West, it's not between the Atlantic or the Pacific. It's between the countries who have money to spend. United States have increased its debt ratio from 100 to 135% of GDP. Eurozone has now reached 100%. Even mainland China has gone from 54 to 70% of the GDP. There is a lot of government money being spent, which also creates a concern for long-term inflation prospects for those who are worried about it. But most of all, the fault line is between those who have access to vaccines and those who have not. United States is now bounced back at 7% growth of GDP, China 8%. But if you look at non-China emerging economies, they are all performing below the global average. And in the latest July IMF report, their prospect has been severely written down almost by 0.5%. So we have reason to be worried and to think that they're going to perform worse. So as these two phases of economic recovery is now actually underpinning the economic security in an overlapping way. And what I'm trying to say is that the themes of the first phase, where we have had massive concentration of investment in the mainland Chinese economy, has not actually subdued. That means that first, when the entirety of the world growth was generated within one economy that was willing to direct that growth into the direction that supports its political objectives, including rewriting the rules of security, trade, and regional balance, it created very difficult interdependencies that could be weaponized. And I would argue that they have. And it limited the policy space in economic statecraft of Western countries as well as Taiwan. Second, those who have controlled the vaccine production have also controlled other countries' pace towards economic recovery. Quickly on the point about vaccination of people in Taiwan, I intended not to say this, but in this regard, I'm very delighted that people of Czech Republic, Lithuania, and Japan, and many countries have come to the aid of Taiwan. And I'm not surprised that it's these countries, because in the end, people who were once forgotten by the world community never forget the feeling of being forgotten. And if my fellow Europeans are listening, I want to send them a stern warning that posterity will not be kind upon those who forget people like Taiwan in this circumstance. It is central to get the Taiwanese economy and other economies in the emerging world and to share the vaccines equitably around the world. And the situation that we have created, I think, has put an unprecedented pressure on not just trade diplomacy, but also general foreign policy and statecraft, because besieged economies and political systems like China, but also Europe and many other places, have become largely non-responsive to external incentives. EU, Europe, and Japan cannot provide enough impetus for economies like Beijing to reform its system and how it conducts its trade, even if we work together. In other words, alliances won't change Beijing or their policy direction. But what I do believe that alliances can do is to mitigate those risks of those weaponized dependencies. But unfortunately, as Scott said, WTO is particularly ill-equipped to address these problems. In fact, I would even argue that the multilateral system is working exactly as its architects intended. It's just that the crisis we are seeing with a global pandemic and the uneven distribution of vaccine and recovery, these two things are heavily interlinked, is actually not something that the drafters of GATT could foresee. This is the reason why I don't think these are rule-defined problems, but actually political problems. And in addition, the uneven prospect of growth, even amongst those who have access to good vaccine, is a problem. I'm thinking about the abysmal growth prospects in Europe and the lack of political capital to undertake reforms. It's no longer just a regional problem. It's actually a global problem, because as certain pockets of growth is monopolizing actually the global demand, Europe without options become a political risk, which I believe Taiwan and its allies must immediately manage. And strategic autonomy in the EU is failing because EU leaders fail to prioritize real strategic risk to its political autonomy. And I would like to talk and end on the point about political autonomy, because currently Taiwan and a very few ASEAN economies provide secure and indirect access to post-pandemic growth that is emerging out of economies like China. Taiwan even grew faster than the mainland economy in 2020. You even got a multiplier effect if you invested in Taiwan. And as Taiwan is actually, despite the low vaccination rate and low access to vaccines, Taiwan has always been a gateway to the region supply chains. And to paraphrase Scott once again, Taiwan knows how to trade with rivals. And in fact, I would argue that economies like Taiwan and many others in the region knows very well how to disarm this weaponized dependency more than anyone else, because they've been doing so for the entire existence. So this is the reason why I really like to urge EU and the Quad to coordinate a twofold Taiwan strategy. First, keep the people of Taiwan safe and vaccinated. I do believe it's our human and historical duty. And if we fail this duty, I think the judgment of history will be very, very harsh on us. And I hope we don't fail Taiwan. The second point is we should selfishly tapping into Taiwan's economic potential. Legally speaking, whether we are talking about EU investment agreement or US FTA or CPTPP accession, these accession routes are open and legitimate avenues for all WTO members, including Taiwan, Europe, and United States. Commercially and politically, I would argue it's more logical to put investment and trade agreements with Taiwan first, not second, because we get a better deal out of Taiwan. And most importantly, refraining from exploring these very potent pockets of growth and innovation that Taiwan represents is an ultimate act of Finlandization. It means that China has the prerogative to deny EU and Washington the right to undertake trade agreements with any WTO member. And that's where the limitation economic policy space that I talked about, that how these interdependencies have limited Western policy space. We cannot allow this to become the norm. I'm sorry I spoke for too long. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ho-Suk. I got the same feeling as Ho-Suk was describing just now. Talking to friends and colleagues from the European area, you got the conclusion that when they look east, there's only China, right? But I would like to borrow what Scott was recommending us. Let's do the maths. If you look at the numbers, you will realize that Asia Pacific is more than China, right? Taiwan plays a very important role in the supply chain. You know, somewhere between 55 to 65% of the products manufactured by Taiwanese companies in China are actually for export, right? They are not actually for the Chinese demand. So those products, made in China products, can be anywhere manufactured by Taiwanese companies in China. So yeah, thank you very much, Ho-Suk, to bring up this issue. There's a much deeper discussion that needed, especially in the European area, on how Taiwan, what's the role of Taiwan, and how EU should be also introducing a new dimension and also dynamics to interact with Taiwan in many of these regards post the COVID-19 pandemic. Okay, we have roughly 20 minutes left, and we have already received several questions now. Maybe I'll just quickly go through the question. Is this the first question? Okay. Now, a question from students from one of the local Tankang University here in Taiwan. The question is that during the COVID-19 pandemic, the spread of the pandemic indicated the weakness and unstable of the global supply chain? I think, well, we already answered part of the questions already, right? So the second part of the question is that are you seeing a breakdown of the global governance structure, especially the WHO? And how do we prevent this kind of situation to occur in the future? Maybe I just add one dimension to that question. That is, what will be the next generation global or world governance structure, trade and health-wise? What's your recommendation? Anyone wants to take the floor first? Challenging question.
Well, let me give it a try. I mean, clearly, the COVID-19 epidemic intertwined with the Trump administration's very aggressive approach to China, and that played out in the WHO. It played out in the WTO. Which was not good for global governance, for sure. I think we have now an opportunity with the Biden administration to go in a different direction. Clearly, a whole range of areas that we have discussed just now, and a lot of the pain points that we have discussed now, they have to be resolved one way or another, either in WTO or in some regional format. And regional formats, they might be, if you want, the proto-WTO solutions, but in the end, you can't avoid the WTO. Whether you talk about industrial policies, it's not, I mean, yes, China has industrial policy like many others. WTO is very weak in addressing industrial policy. So you have to talk about that. You have to set rules there that everybody can abide by. CPTPP is one step towards that. I think more needs to be done. Data governance is another issue that has come up similarly. The issue of environmental sustainability is one that's going to come to the fore with the Europeans imposing a carbon, what they call a carbon border adjustment. It's a carbon tax, and I'm very much in favor. I think that's what you should do, but it's going to be a huge WTO issue. Big issues that need to be discussed, and frankly, you can find temporary regional solutions for it, but I think we cannot avoid the global discussion. Unfortunately, I think the new Director General of the WTO is convinced of that and is very progressive. She's a former boss of mine, so I give former boss praises, and I'm hopeful that there will be a renewed emphasis on the negotiation part of the WTO.
Honorable Hill, please.
Right, this is very important question. And I think that as the governments battle the pandemic and then to face of rising geopolitical tensions, I think most governments are switching from that pursuit of efficiency to, in some sense, to self-reliance. But as we talked already, I think resilience comes not from self-reliance, but from that diverse source of supply. Okay, so we have to keep in mind how important the role of supply chains in this sense. And another aspect is that I think the reason why that the governments are too much concerned about some resilience issues, that the decay of international trading rules makes countries more wary of relying on each other. So in this, as already excellent speakers already mentioned, that some kind of the trade agreements, like a bilateral or some regional agreement, might help to solve these issues too. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Scott or Hosuk, would you like to reflect on that question? Or maybe we can move on to the next question. Okay, let me just, yeah, please.
Just a quick word. I'll speak here as a disgraced trade negotiator first and a thinker second. And as I said, the multilateral system has effectively failed to address the pandemic problem because we couldn't envisage the scale of the problem when we drafted the rules. And the way that, for example, the WTO rules were drafted says that if a country or a member comes under stress, it is allowed to control its exports. And we just didn't envisage a situation where everybody in the world is under duress. So this is the reason why we're under the crisis. That's what I mean by the original intention of the drafters. I think what we've seen, exactly as the previous speakers have pointed out, is that in the post-American leadership, we are now looking into a situation where we have to exercise leadership collectively. And no one is actually fit to do this, because we saw early attempts by EU to try to step into the gap that was created by US leadership. But leadership entails actually paying for benefit of others. And that's something that neither Europe and mainland China is currently ready to do. And so we are actually in a very much leadership-less and rule-less and governance-minus world. And that breaks down pretty much into regional dependencies. And that really doesn't bode well. Thank you.
Thank you. I think the next question is also related. So let's move on to the next question, then we can come back to pick up some of the questions or debates, or not really debates, but issues that we have been left behind. The question is from Jennifer. She's from the University of Queensland, Australia, I guess. The question is, how do you think Taiwan's role will change, if at all, in the post-COVID global economy? Do you currently see a trend of continued globalization or deglobalization? And the last part is, what role will APEC play in the post-COVID economy? Well, Taiwan's role. I'm not going to answer the question. I'm going to invite you, all the panelists, to share with us what do you think about Taiwan's role in the post-COVID global economy? Scott, you want to take the floor first? Yes, please.
Sure. Having traveled to Taiwan for 30 plus years, watching the island remodel itself again and again, from small businesses to very large, successful global companies, very adaptable. Even with all of the problems and global forces that Hosuk mentioned that are working against it, Taiwan has managed to adapt and do quite well. So there is a significant chance that U.S.-China decoupling will be pretty significant. People will go too far. They will react to each other, and we will see significant reduction in trade. And I think that will have negative pressures on Taiwan's economy. On the other hand, maybe we'll do things better. I think it's really critical is how much optimism can Americans have about their place in the world? A very unoptimistic, very pessimistic America tends to make very stupid policy choices, which hurt the U.S. some, but hurt others in smaller places like Taiwan a lot more. So I'm hoping that we get some stronger waves of optimism in the U.S. and getting through the pandemic will be quite helpful to that. Taiwan will adapt, I think, one way or the other. Question is, will it be a harder environment for it to adapt in, or will it be easier? In terms of APEC, I think most folks saw the Vice President of the United States in her visit to Southeast Asia recently announced that the U.S. would like to host APEC in 2023. I think that's very good news for APEC. I don't think that's necessarily going to totally transform the organization to give it teeth and make all of the members work together, but it shows a more significant American commitment to providing some of those public goods that Hosuk mentioned, not just showing up, but trying to address some of these issues. And so I think there can be some more creativity with APEC, with other regional institutions to provide opportunities for Taiwan and smaller powers who are trying to navigate these very difficult storms that we're currently going through.
Scott, are you going to describe a current U.S. policy as a trend of deglobalization, or is the term deglobalization the appropriate term to describe the trend of policy direction?
I wouldn't go that far, because I mean, right now we're just kind of spinning our wheels and not doing a whole lot. We're just adapting, and I think taking very small micro steps. We've added some companies to our entities list and things like that, but as a proportion of total trade and investment, we've barely moved the needle, even with some of the actions we've taken with regard to Hong Kong or Xinjiang. I think what we're trying to do is reimagine what globalization might be like, where we also focus on achieving goals related to the environment, to labor, and right now we're just struggling for what those solutions might be. And this is a large transition that the United States is going through with no clear solutions. I don't think it ends up being deglobalization. I think it's going to be something more different than that. But exactly where it's going to end up, I'm not sure. That's why we all have jobs, because we're supposed to help determine the outcome of where we're going.
Thank you. Director Hoffman.
Yeah, I mean, whether we talk about deglobalization, I do think we will see a phase of regionalization. And in part it is because the global supply chains, they already ran out of steam even before COVID, even before the US-China tension. So they were no longer gaining. A lot of the efficiency gains that were to be had were there, and there were no big economies opening up anymore, and therefore, if you want, they were going globalization was going sideways for the past decade, especially since the global financial crisis. Now we see, in part, we see a policy-driven development, especially in China. Don't forget China and China's new dual circulation strategy. I don't think it's a deglobalization strategy, but it is for them also to become less dependent on trade in critical supply chains, but much more broader. So maybe they're ahead of that game. Second, you see a deeper integration with Southeast Asia, between China and Southeast Asia. At the same time, in Europe, I mean, Europe is doing very well within Europe. It's a tremendous integration, how they integrated the Eastern Europeans into the European sphere. But at the same time, the outside interaction has become less as a share of GDP. I'm not necessarily saying that they stopped trading, but it's become less important for them than the European internal trade. And so you see much more of a regional blocks occurring. And the United States, in a way, seems to be pitching for that as well. With NAFTA and extended NAFTA, they feel more safer there, that the supply chains closer to home, not necessarily at home, but closer to home. So you might see a tendency towards more sort of three blocks in the world until there are further motivations to further opening up. And I particularly look at India. Over time, Africa will be a big opportunity where you have renewed opportunities for efficiency gain that might re-globalize the economy. Thanks.
Thank you, Bert. Honorable Hume, Korea is a very important member of the APEC, and I guess you play also a very key role in the policy formulation process for Korea during your turn as the Vice Prime Minister for Korea's participation of the APEC. So what's your view about the future APEC? to play in a post-COVID economy?
I think after pandemic, I think that there should be some restructuring of the international architecture. So in many senses, one of the features I'm thinking is that some way of that some regional block might be rebuilt. I mean, for example, I don't know what's coming in the APEC regions, but in that sense, I think Taiwan might be some kind of roles in the whole respect of the region. For example, as far as my understanding is correct, Taiwan's technology is quite upfront. So in that sense, I think that Taiwan might be some role in the area of technology, some kind of development. For example, I think that some kind of communication technology, I think, continue to reshape the lives and the economy. Right? So in that sense, the role of the Taiwan might be some kind of very important in the future. Another aspect is Taiwan. I think that in some sense, Taiwan might be one of the major likely minded countries in the sense of that how to some way to solve the pandemic issues or how to preserve so real spirit of globalization, because Taiwan is in some sense front runner of globalization in most emerging economies. So in that sense, I think I'm not quite say that a specific role in the APEC, but I think there might be some different round of that some collaboration in the APEC regions. That's mine.
Thank you very much, Honorable Hume. Because of the time limitation, I think this will be the last question for this session. So, Ho-Suk, would you like to offer some, not really closing remarks, but few words on those questions? Taiwan's role, or how about deglobalization and globalization? How do you see that?
Well, as previous speakers have said, I don't think we are deglobalizing. If you look at the total amount of assets outstanding, we are really not deglobalizing. I mean, the amount of interaction in terms of capital that is placed abroad versus in the domestic economy, there is no trend towards deglobalization. What we see, I think, is a trend towards a different mode of globalization, where we have spoken about United States, and as an example, I'll continue on that route, and where United States have largely gone from a trade-led globalization to investment-led globalization. And I think it's about time that the Taiwanese economy will also go into that track, and many other export-led economies like Germany would have to do that transition at certain point as we become richer and we move more towards services. That's definitely true. Basically, the model of globalization has changed. The second problem, and that's the potential. Then the problem comes as we change the modes and as the landscape changed. I think what we have seen is that the political sensitivities have changed. They're moved from one particular kind of sectors to another kind of sector. We have seen sensitivities around certain economies moving towards another economy. And it is, in a sense, a great rebalancing that we are seeing now. It's not just about breaking up and bifurcation, and we are not just talking about the security parameters here. We very often forget that United States have about the same amount of investment in China as in Japan. Whereas if you look at certain economies like Germany, or not to say the least, Taiwan, we have been overexposed to the mainland market. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but diversification is also a good thing. So the adjustment that we have heard about is not deglobalization, but is perhaps a reglobalization, where the underlying the factors have changed and we are basically adapting to new economic realities. And on that point, I agree with everyone who has spoken here today that I am convinced that Taiwan will adapt, and it is adapting very well. Despite all the hardship coming against it, it comes out on top. So I am actually less worried about Taiwan. And the slogan of Taiwan of this year is Taiwan can help. So I would like to put the question the other way around. How should the world help Taiwan now? And thank you so much for the 6 million face masks.
Thank you very much, Ho-Suk. Indeed, Taiwan has been doing a great job in the last 18 months. We would like to offer some of our experiences and resources to facilitate and also to learn from others. And that's, I think, the objective of this year's forum. If there's any consensus of this session, I would like to borrow what Ho-Suk has been concluding. We are actually in the process of rebalancing. It's not a complete destroying of the establishment, but rather we are creating new forms of collaboration, new forms of interaction, new forms of dealing with a country like China. Second generation integration of Chinese economy into the global economy, probably that's what we're going to witness in the next decades to come. But thank you very much for the very, very interesting, insightful 70 minutes. I hope it's worth jet-lagging for Scott. And hopefully next year we'll be fly to Washington and we will enjoy the jet lag and continue the dialogue somewhere else. But most welcome. We would like to see you all in Taiwan in the near future. Thank you very much for joining us. And this will be the end of this session. Thank you.
Okay, thanks to all the panelists and Mr. Roy Lee for such a valuable insight and dialogue today. The forum has successfully come to the end. Last but not least, we would like to invite Deputy Minister, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Tianjong Guang, once again to deliver the closing remarks for us.
Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. It is indeed an honor to speak with you today. On behalf of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of China, Taiwan, I would like to extend my gratitude to all of you for participating in the凱達格蘭Forum online to consider the traditional and non-traditional threat and the challenges we will face in the post-COVID-19 world. Today, our forum had quite a number of productive discussions. More than 20 current and former officials, scholars, and experts from 10 countries have offered valuable insights on a range of important issues. We are particularly gratified to have Ambassador Kelly Craft, former U.S. Permanent Representative to the United Nations, deliver an opening keynote speech this morning. Her speech expressed staunch support and friendship for Taiwan, and it reminded us the fact that Taiwan as a force for good will never be alone on the way of pursuing freedom and democracy. If we sum up the keyword being mentioned most frequently through our 4 panel discussions today, whether we were talking about Taiwan Strait development, Indo-Pacific stability, gray zone coercion, or reconstructing global supply chain, China is no doubt the main theme of our shared concern. In recent years, political, economic, military, and technological dynamics in the Indo-Pacific have evolved rapidly. In addition to the sea changes, COVID-19 has had devastating impact since its emergence last year. However, in every crisis there is opportunity. While China is expanding hegemony and spreading tentacles throughout the world during the pandemic, China has also exposed its true malicious global ambitions. Thus, over the past few months, like-minded countries have reached a consensus on security issues arising from China and then come closer together to promote a free and open Indo-Pacific and to safeguard our belief of democracy and freedom. The resurgence of the Quad is a striking example. Following the first Quad summit took place on March 12th, the second summit is scheduled to be held this autumn. At this interval, the Quad working groups on vaccines, critical technologies, and climate change have also some progress. At the same time, the G7 summit, NATO summit, the EU-US summit, etc., also demonstrated a united desire for a world anchored by democratic values and unconstrained by coercion. We can see a trans-Pacific alliance of like-minded democracies gradually taking shape and a renewed transatlantic partnership. In today's discussions related to the Quad, it may take a time for the Quad to become fully institutionalized, and it may be an early stage to discuss enlargement. However, for now, Quad is still an ideal platform for the four like-minded nations to develop cooperations on all aspects pertinent to security and the well-being of the people in the democratic communities. Also, it leaves open the possibility for making specific Quad Plus activities depending on the interest and availability of other partners. I do hope and I believe Taiwan will participate in some form in the near future. On many occasions in the international arena, the importance of the peace and the stability in Taiwan Strait has been underscored recently. It shows Taiwan Strait development is not just a cross-strait issue, but a global concern as well. Any development in the Taiwan Strait is indeed a challenge, not only to the Indo-Pacific liberal order, but also the rest of the world. Why Taiwan matters? Taiwan is of critical strategic importance to the region and the world. Taiwan is a defender of shared values, a sharp contrast with authoritarian China. Taiwan is situated in the middle of the first island chain in the West Pacific, a crucial geographical position to contain China's military power and its spread of authoritarianism. Taiwan is a key partner in the global ICT industry as well, especially in the supply chain of semiconductor. Due to its strategic position in many aspects, Taiwan faces tremendous challenges and threats from China. For example, PRC warplanes and the vessels have continuously encircled Taiwan. More than 150 days as of today this year, Chinese warplanes could be spotted on Taiwan's ADIZ. In addition, Chinese government-backed disinformation flooded Taiwan. We received nearly 30 million attacks a month, and about half of which are suspected to come from China. However, facing military and non-military attacks, Taiwan has never succumbed to the pressure from China, but has become the front line of all democracies against China's highlighted rhetoric assault, military intimidation, and all sorts of gray zone tactics. Taiwan is able and willing to share our experiences of how to defend democracy for more than half a century. Taiwan is a reliable partner ready to contribute as a force for good. Taiwan not only safeguards its democratic way of life with great determination, but also commits to working with like-minded partners to promote democracy, security, and prosperity across the region. To echo discussions today, Taiwan strongly calls for China to refrain from provocative and destabilizing gray zone activities in East Asia waters and to resolve conflicts by peaceful means throughout multilateral negotiation. In addition, I also agree that supply chains should be a source of strength instead of weakness in the global economy. And it is vital to build trusted global supply chain. Also politically and commercially, it is logical to consider Taiwan to be the top partner in these economic reconstructions. Taiwan's continued promotion of multilateral dialogue is part of how we are working to find peaceful resolution to the security issues of our day. The凱達格蘭Forum is one example of our commitment to being an active, reliable partner in the Indo-Pacific. At this challenging time, Taiwan stands in solidarity with the partners, and we hope our friends would also stand by us. Together, we can realize a free, open, inclusive, and resilient Indo-Pacific democracy will and must prevail in the end. In closing, I would like to take this opportunity to express our thanks to the Prospect Foundation and the people working behind. Particularly, I would like to thank you for joining us. We look forward to seeing you again next year. Goodbye.